What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Just caught the new flick It, based on the Stephen King novel from 1986, and just wanted to offer a quick review. But for people who don't want any spoilers, I will speak in very broad, general terms initially, and I'll give you a warning before I dive into anything that might spoil the overall experience for you. I'm old enough to remember when this novel came out. It basically took the world by storm. It was officially the best-selling novel of that year, but I can remember before I even knew who Stephen King was, walking into a bookstore and just seeing piles and piles of hardbacks all over the place with that first edition book cover, which still doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's got this little like reptile claw. I've never quite understood what that's all about. In any case, I'd been watching a lot of movies and shows based on Stephen King books up to that point, not even knowing who Stephen King was. But about a year later, started reading his books, starting with Misery. And over the course of the next 30 years or so, I gradually picked off the majority of his novels from like the mid-70s to the early 90s. I've read a few novels past that point as well, but that mid-70s to early 90s period is really, really important to me. And if you live in the New York area, I'm actually going to be talking about this very topic on the night of September 21st at the Nighthawk Cinema at the next Kevin Geeks Out show. Just a quick shameless plug. But I was in 8th grade when the first TV show of It came out, which absolutely blew my mind at the time. I have revisited it since then, and sometimes you should not go home again because certain shows from the 80s and 90s have not aged in the most favorable fashion. However, I will say that Tim Curry's Pennywise is still pure dynamite. Huge high five to Tim Curry for his interpretation of the character, even if the show was very much of its time. Strangely enough, it took me a long time to actually read the book. It's a big, giant whopper of a novel. I tried reading it, I think like in middle school, and bailed after a couple chapters, but then finally got around to it several decades later and absolutely loved it. So I was really, really intrigued as to how they would tackle it when I heard that they were starting to work on a feature film. I was sad to hear that Cary Fukunaga parted ways with the project, but I was still curious, especially once I saw the trailers, which were, as we all know, pretty goddamn good. For people who don't know, the novel basically tells the story of these characters as children and as adults, simultaneously going back and forth as they go through their fights and struggles with Pennywise, leading up to what is basically like a dual climax on both fronts. And that can be pretty unwieldy when you're dealing with movies, so I totally understand why they decided to break that format in two. And this first movie concerns itself exclusively with the children, which I guess is kind of a shame because part of the initial narrative hook of the novel is just how terrified these adults are when they hear that It has returned, and are they going to return to Derry as promised? And that's when we start to learn the story about what happened to them as children. In an interesting narrative twist for people my age, they have pushed the story forward to 1989 when the characters are children, which works perfectly for me because I was a 13-year-old child in 1989. So for purely sentimental reasons, I relate to the story on a deep emotional level. That said, I think pretty much everybody will be able to find something to relate to in the Losers Club, because if you don't know, it's about 7 children who become aware of the fact that there's this ancient force that is preying upon their town of Derry. Like the rate of children dying and or going missing in their town is 6 times the national average, and historically this phenomenon tends to happen roughly every 27 years or so. And they finally figure out there is this demonic entity that sometimes is in the form of a clown, but for the most part preys upon your fears before trying to kill you, and they decide to band together and kill this thing before it picks them off one at a time. Like, together they are strong, and separate they are weak. And by far the strongest part of this movie is a sense of camaraderie within this circle of friends. As with any movie, when you're dealing with child actors or young teen actors, it's a roll of the dice in terms of what you're going to get, and I would not say they all have an even level or an equal level of acting ability, but there are a few standouts who really knock it out of the park. Young Sophia Lillis is going to be breaking a lot of hearts with every teenage boy in America for the next year or two as they fall in love with her watching this movie. And Finn Wolfhard, who has a name that sounds like a goddamn porn star, who people will probably remember from Stranger Things and the upcoming Stranger Things 2, he's really good as Richie in this as well. I liked his character a lot. Another great thing this movie does, it really captures the town, the setting, the place. I mean, it has some of the most stunningly beautiful photography of any horror movie I've seen over the last couple of years, from the way they shoot the sewers and the surrounding wilderness and just the children riding around on bicycles. It really does establish this perfect tone and sense of place, which makes it all the more horrifying that there's this dark underbelly, because in the context of this story, it is just part of the overall problem. There's also just there's like a cancer at the heart of this town where adults are indifferent to or choose to ignore the suffering of others. If they see a child being bullied, they will probably ignore it and just let it happen. Or if a child goes missing, they'll be sad for a little while, but as soon as another one goes missing, it's kind of out with the old, in with the new. It's a town without a soul, or a town with a soul that's been damaged or corrupted, and Pennywise is absolutely at the heart of that. So before I get into any specifics, I'll just say it is pretty goddamn scary. Probably more thrilling than scary in the latter half. I mean, initially, in the first few scenes we see with it, or Pennywise, it's pretty sensational. If you're going for scares and horror and dread, it's got all that. It's got eerie qualities, it's an interesting mood, a lot of tension, some legit jump scares. And then toward the end of the story, definitely gets a little bit more like thrills and chases and that sort of thing, which isn't necessarily what I want out of a Stephen King movie. But the crowd that I was with roared with thunderous approval at the end of the movie, applauding like mad. And when they saw that it was chapter 1, that made them even more excited. So it seems like this movie is going to be a giant, colossal smash hit. And justifiably so. They do a lot of things really well. Any problems that I have with it come primarily from the fact that because I've read the book, I've got my own personal grievances with some changes to the structure and plot. But I'll get into more of that once I get into my spoiler section. In any case, it's a very effective horror movie. I'm glad they stuck the landing. I might have my minor quibbles, but they in no way should dissuade somebody from seeing it or dampen somebody's enthusiasm if they're considering seeing it. I feel like we have our first really fun crowd pleaser of the fall, and hopefully it'll be the first of many to come. So anyway, all warnings about spoilers are now officially over. I'm going to be diving into some specifics, so if you don't want to hear those, bail out. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what worked and what didn't on a more specific level. As I mentioned before, the chemistry and the camaraderie between the kids is absolutely sensational. There's a really, really great scene where the boys decide they're going to go swimming in a quarry hole, and they're all hanging out in their tighty-whities, debating whether or not they're going to jump in or who's going to jump in, and who should arrive but Beverly, the girl they all have a crush on, and she strips down and jumps in, and they all jump in after, and they all have a great time swimming and chicken fighting and that sort of thing. But the way this movie captures teenage slang and teenage shit talking, like their false sense of bravado, their insecurities and their overconfidence, that's when the movie really soars. And while the dialogue is definitely been modernized and it doesn't necessarily feel specific to Stephen King, this movie overall is very true to the spirit of the novel, even if it makes a lot of very overt specific changes to how Pennywise pursues certain people or how they fight him at the end of the story. But yeah, in terms of the tone and the atmosphere and emotion, it felt like Stephen King's It, even if just by virtue of the fact that you're taking this 1,200-page book and trying to strip it down to 2 feature films, a lot of the text and a lot of the detail is going to have to go. That's just the reality. If you want the full It experience, the novel is readily available. And even though this movie takes place in 1989, it still felt very 50s. And maybe that's just because I've seen the original show and I've read the book, and so I have a very hard time disassociating Derry and what goes on there outside of the 50s. It just feels like a 50s town. That said, there are some very overt 1989 references, specifically with the character of Ben, who has a closet interest in the New Kids on the Block. For those of you who did not grow up in the 80s, there's one really, really good part about having not grown up in the 80s is that you did not have to endure the phenomenon of New Kids on the Block and the endless comparisons a lot of people were making between NKOTB and the Beatles. My little sister was obsessed with New Kids on the Block, and so I was exposed to their videos and their music ad nauseum, but I was a colossal Beatles fan, so I took it very, very personally whenever somebody compared those little teeny boppers with my musical idols. In any case, Ben likes New Kids on the Block, but he's trying to keep it a secret. And there's this great scene where they come over to his place to look at all the history of Derry and all the various disasters that have happened, and they're basically just trying to piece together the entire puzzle. And Beverly's looking around his room, and she just quietly closes the bedroom door. And of course, on the back of it is this giant New Kids poster, and some of the music kicks in. And she shares this little look with him where you can tell she thinks it's adorable, she thinks it's cute, but she's not going to blow his cover, and she opens the door back up so nobody will see the posters. It's a very, very sweet, tender moment between these two characters, but also I was just laughing my ass off. Another thing that I thought worked really, really well were the Pennywise scenes where he was talking. Like, there are a lot of different ways that Pennywise goes after his victims in this, but the ones that for me that were the most disturbing were the ones like in the opening of the movie when he's talking to George. He's talking to him, and you can tell it's almost like he enjoys hanging out with children. Like, obviously the goal is that he's going to feed on these children, because it's all about, as they describe in the book, it's like salting the meat. If you don't make them afraid first, they don't taste as good. They're not as nourishing. So he has to create these illusions in order to drive terror into them. But as portrayed by Bill Skarsgård, at least in the initial scene, it's almost like he can't contain his glee and excitement, that he really, really loves and enjoys talking with children because he gets to go back to an innocent place of his own, even if he knows full well his ultimate goal is to rip them limb from limb and feast on them, that sort of thing. And it just made it so much more eerie and disturbing, especially like the way his eyes kind of don't look straight ahead. They really, really nail his look and his mannerisms. Where I thought Pennywise was less scary is there are several times where the CGI takes over and he'll just kind of charge at somebody and arms wailing, or he'll grow to an enormous size. And it just, at that point when the computers take over, I'm like, oh, well, I'm safe now because I'm just looking at some really, really expensive special effects that aren't necessarily scare-inducing. They're more thrilling, they're more exciting, not terrifying. So my main grievances with the movie are at the very end, where there's a pretty overt change to the plot that results in the Losers Club briefly breaking up and then reassembling in order to save Beverly after she's been basically kidnapped by Pennywise. And it felt very notes driven. Like some executive in some meeting said, look, we need to have like a crisis near the end of the story that's going to temporarily think the Losers Club is going to all break up and then they'll get back together, blah, blah, blah. It didn't feel true to the novel. And who knows, maybe if I hadn't read the book, I wouldn't have minded it at all. Suddenly the writing style seemed to change, and for me it was very noticeable. However, I totally understand how they felt the need to make some changes to the structure and the ending. As I mentioned before, they obviously had to break apart the flashback story and the present day story. But for people who remember, there's all this stuff about like the ritual of Chud and other dimensions and some really, really crazy out there stuff that isn't necessarily for everyone. I mean, when I talk to people who love the book It, what they love is the town, and they love the scenes where Pennywise is hunting people down, and they love the friendship between the characters. But I've never really heard a lot of people ranting or raving about how much they love the ending of either narrative. For people who don't know, the flashback narrative with the children ends in rather controversial fashion, where they get lost in the tunnels below, and they basically have this giant orgy to kind of reform like their group harmony in order to escape. Obviously, if you tried to have a group orgy with 13-year-old children in a movie today, people would flip the fuck out. The fact that it was in a best-selling novel still is a bit bewildering to me, but I guess people just rolled with it. Or it was just such a big book, they never got to that point, so they never had a chance to get angry. But they changed that, which I totally understand. But it'll be interesting to see how they handle the ending of the adult portion when they get around to Chapter 2. I am genuinely excited to see Chapter 2. While I did not think this movie was a total home run, I still thoroughly fucking enjoyed it. Bring on number 2. I'm ready to see it as soon as they're ready to release it. I mean, when this movie drew to a close and the Losers Club is hugging and bonding and holding hands and that sort of thing, I was feeling chills and I was genuinely emotionally moved by the story of these 7 children. So yeah, thumbs up all around. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've got my little quibbles, but in the end, who cares? It was a very, very cool Stephen King adaptation. It's been a long time since I've seen a really cool Stephen King adaptation. Consider me a fan. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this review. Greatly appreciate it if you consider giving my channel a subscribe. If you want to talk more, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax, or leave a comment in the comments below. And I think my next video will probably be a review of that new sci-fi spoof show, The Orville, but I don't know. If the show's great, I'll probably do a review. If the show sucks, maybe I'll skip it entirely. But as always, I greatly appreciate the support. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all soon.